Is Superman woke? It's the question on everyone's minds recently. For whatever reason, before this movie has come out, there has been a little bit of a right-wing panic claiming that Superman is actually super woke, which I found very hilarious and gave me yet another reason to go see this movie, is to see whether or not the political themes actually match up with what they're saying, whether this is a big overreaction, whether there's actually something there. And I think that it's interesting to look at this because the truth is the movie does have a pretty clear political message if you are going to look at it as a piece of politics. Now, I don't think that's the only thing worth talking about with this movie, and I don't think that's the focus of the production behind this movie was for a specific political message. I think it was, much more concerned with the creative storytelling, the characters of the movie, and, the politics of that are reflective more so just of the worldviews of the creators and their understanding of the world, which I think is also an important thing to look at. But basically, the reason this was talked about so much before this movie is because James Gunn made a comment about Superman being an immigrant. Right-wing media latched onto this in this particularly anti-immigrant time where Donald Trump is attacking immigrants all across the country in a very vicious way. And this is a very topical conversation. And, James Gunn's brother, Sean Gunn, actually responded and came out with a pretty, strong defense of immigrants and connecting that to the American story that Superman is so typical of. And I think that this is an interesting thing to talk about because, this has very much been part of Superman's character from the beginning. James Gunn was right when he said Superman is an immigrant who has kindness for everyone. That is very much core to the character. And the character has had a lot of left-wing political messages in the comics for a long time. There's a great article in Cosmonaut about this that I will link. That article goes into a lot of detail about the various ways that Superman has related to politics in mostly the comics history, which I think is very interesting. He's done things like fighting the KKK, just supporting working class people in general, fighting against the rich. Obviously, his probably most famous villain is Lex Luthor, who is a billionaire. And then there's also the role of journalism in the media as a major theme in a lot of Superman comics because he is a journalist himself. And in this movie, that's actually a very big theme, is the role of the media, which I think was another fascinating political angle that is probably not talked about as much. Of course, the probably main focus now, other than the immigrant thing, is the geopolitical angle. People are comparing the conflict in this movie to Israel's invasion of Gaza, and I think that there is some valid comparisons there, which I'll break down in more detail later once we get into the spoilers section, because I don't want to just spoil everything right out the gate. But before we get into all that, let's back up a little bit and talk about where Superman is as a character going into this, and why I personally was very excited for this movie before I was even necessarily thinking about the political aspects as much, and just thinking about the character and where a good Superman movie could take us. Fundamentally, like I said, Superman is a character about kindness. He's a character in a lot of ways about hope and many positive feelings. But it feels like over the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of attempts to kind of subvert that idea, whether it be the Zack Snyder interpretation of Superman, which is the last time we saw him on the big screen, which was definitely a much darker read on the character, even though Superman was still portrayed as a fundamentally good person. But there's also situations that have been very popular in mass media, like the Injustice video game series, where Superman has been portrayed as an outright villain. And there's plenty of other examples that at least take away from the typical Superman narrative. I think people sometimes point to characters like Omni-Man or Homelander as subversions of the Superman trope in ways that make the character, evil pretty much. So I think with all that kind of swirling around, there was a lot of excitement for this movie for the potential to kind of return to that original optimistic, positive Superman. And I was personally excited for that too. I'm not a huge comic book reader. I'm trying to get into it a little bit more recently. But I have read All-Star Superman, which is one of the comics that this movie takes some inspiration from. And I thought that was a really fun read. And I really like the kind of vision, the fun sci-fi aspects of that I definitely see in this movie. So I was very excited hearing that that comic was going to be inspiring this movie to some extent. And I did find that the idea of the political themes, once we started getting the trailers, to be very interesting. Superman seems to be stopping a war in the movie. That's, really fascinating to see what's going on with that. I always love when they throw a fake country in there because, this is a fake country. It's not supposed to be a real country, but in reality, it's representing something in the real world. And before the movie came out, I think a lot of us were kind of unsure if that was going to be one thing or the other. Now, a lot of people are definitely drawing the comparison to Palestine. Of course, the typical themes of fighting the rich, journalism, and all the other ideas that Superman really hits on politically a lot of times in the comics and other media were definitely going to at least play a part in this movie. The DC Universe is kind of revamping, and I've also just been excited for the creative vision under James Gunn because I liked his work, of course, in the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, but in the DC Universe, we had a pretty solid run of the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker back in the original DCEU. And a lot of that is going to kind of carry over to the new DCU too and stay in some sort of canon. And then we also had the Creature Commandos animated show, which I also made a video about when that came out, which I think was a good start to the DCU and kind of get the ball rolling a little bit and see a little bit what James Gunn's storytelling is going to be like. On top of that, we had characters like Green Lantern, who are finally going to make a return to film and television and live action and, the mainstream DC cinematic universe, which I thought was really cool. I've always been a big Green Lantern fan. The representation of Guy Gardner in this movie is really good. And, seeing characters like Mr. Terrific, which I didn't really know about before this, was also exciting to kind of get a glimpse at these new characters that are going to be a lot more popular, I think, after this movie comes out. So that being said, I definitely had very high expectations going into this. And for the most part, I think the movie lived up to it. I definitely have a few critiques here and there, which I'll get into. But overall, despite my expectations being very high, I liked the movie a lot. I've seen it twice in theaters at this point. I kind of wanted to give it a second watch just to sit with it a little bit and see if I developed any more takes that I could bring to you all for this video. And I think that it was overall a very good movie. I think that generally a critique I would have is there could be a little bit better timing. There are certain things that I feel like could have been fleshed out more. There's certain things that they maybe could have dropped. There's kind of a lot in this movie. And for the most part, I like that. I like all the little characters that we get to see that are more minor roles. Some of them really shine in this movie, and I don't want to get rid of all of that and just, focus just on Superman. But I do think that there are elements of the movie that could have been given a little bit more breathing room, and I'll go into that a little bit as we get through the individual characters. I think the beginning was a little bit harder to get into, and it got better as we got into the later parts of the movie, when a lot of the different things that have been happening started coming together. And, overall, this is kind of what you'd expect from a James Gunn Superman movie. He gets the characters right, he knows his comic books, he knows what Superman and Lois Lane and Lex Luthor and the Kents are all supposed to be, and he gets the essence of their characters right in a way that I think is really cool to see. He loves his obscure characters. He's made the Guardians of the Galaxy and the Suicide Squad and Creature Commandos are all about these little obscure characters, and of course he's going to bring some of them into Superman. I'm not saying all these characters are super obscure. Obviously, a lot of people know about Green Lantern and Hawkgirl and stuff like that, but I do think that it is a nice mix of characters from varying levels of popularity in the comics and other media. And James Gunn is always good at kind of bringing that together into kind of a ragtag team of superheroes, which we do get a little bit of that in this movie. I don't think that's a big spoiler. But yeah, I really like that, and that's kind of what you'd expect from James Gunn. In terms of the comedy of this movie, I think that there is a lot of good moments. Not everything lands, of course, but for the most part, it works pretty well. I think the characters that got the best reactions in my theater were definitely Mr. Terrific, Crypto, and Guy Gardner's Green Lantern. Obviously, Superman and Lois and Lex, got also positive reactions, but those three really stood out as kind of a surprise stars of the film. And, there were also some jokes and moments that were definitely more crude than I expected. And I guess to explain that, I want to go ahead and just say, we're going to get into spoilers now, because I do want to talk about some of that and go a little bit more in depth in some of the characters and what they did through the movies and what I liked and didn't like. Okay, so with that out of the way, the one thing that I did find kind of interesting is the harem comment. So basically, to explain what I'm talking about, for those who, for some reason, don't know already, I'm going to be spoiling a certain thing, so you probably should go see the movie. You'll probably still, be able to enjoy it either way, but I do recommend going to see it beforehand. Basically, there's a moment where it is revealed, and it seems to be legitimate, that Superman's Kryptonian parents actually wanted him to conquer the Earth and have as many children as he can, and what Lex Luthor and his enemies start describing as his harem, forming a harem and getting a bunch of people pregnant and building like a Superman army, which is something that we've seen in other superhero media. I think of Invincible and some stuff that happens later in those comics. Anyway, but it's kind of crazy. Of course, Superman's not really doing this, but it's funny to just kind of see that thrown around in a Superman movie. It's not what I would expect. But overall, the characters are more or less what you'd expect from them. I think Superman is a little bit more on the immature and naive side in certain ways. He's still fundamentally correct about everything in the movie in a moral sense, I think. But you do see a little bit of immaturity that I think he grows on throughout the movie, and that's kind of his main arc, is kind of learning how to accept certain things about the world, whether it be about his parents or about the nature of these issues that he's struggling with throughout the movie. Lois is also, of course, I think wonderfully portrayed, wonderfully written, but also you see her care for Superman and their relationship as a really strong part of this movie. You got some tension in their relationship, which I find very interesting. It's in their early stages. They're still kind of figuring out what it means to be together and whether it's going to work or not. At one point, Lois says it's not going to work, and then later she kind of takes that back. So I think that's a very interesting dynamic and adds another source of tension in the movie. But you of course know that Superman and Lois Lane are going to end up together, and when they do and kiss at the end, everyone was going crazy in my theater, partially because that scene was filmed in Cleveland, and I saw it in Cleveland, so everyone's like, oh my gosh, that's the arcade in Cleveland, that's so cool. But also everyone is excited to see Superman and Lois kiss and make out, and that scene's in the trailer, so everybody's probably seen that already. From the other characters in The Day of the Planet, Jimmy Olsen definitely stands out. I think his character is very funny, very charming. That's kind of the whole bit of his character, is that he's so charming that every woman finds him attractive. And I think his dynamic with Lex's girlfriend is very interesting from a plot perspective. It kind of helps tie everything together and is a pretty important part of the plot of the movie. And I think it works pretty well. I mean, it's a little silly, it's a little goofy, but that's kind of this whole movie, really, to be honest. It's a kind of silly, goofy time, and I think Jimmy Olsen being a big hit with the ladies is a good part of that. Okay, so now to get into some of the other superheroes in this movie, we have the Justice Gang, which at least is what Guy Gardner wants the team to be called. And to start off with Guy, he is great in this movie. He is hilarious. I kept looking forward to all the scenes he was going to be in. In the second time, I was like, oh, Guy Gardner's scene's about to come up. Let's go. And I think that the way they portray his character, like I said, I'm not a huge comic books reader, but I, have heard of Guy Gardner, and I'm aware of his general personality, and I think it seems like he's 100% nailing that. But also just everything about it is done in such an interesting way. The light contrasts he's making with the Green Lantern are always super interesting, and I think are done super well. They look super great, and they feel very powerful. Mr. Terrific, of course, was amazing. Standout. He is a very funny character. His stoic kind of, comedy plays well with the other characters. And he's also super badass, especially that one scene when he is rolling into the Lex Luthor compound and defending Lois Lane. That is just a great scene. And music, everything. I'll get into a little bit other aspects of that scene later, but I think that's a great moment. Hawkgirl is pretty good. She doesn't get quite as much screen time, except for when she kills the president of Bravia, which, that's a great scene. But other than that, she doesn't have any super iconic moments, but it has a good rapport with the other members of the Justice Gang, and is a well-done character, I think. We also have Metamorpho, who maybe is not officially a member of the Justice Gang, unless, he's kind of seems to be joining it in the end of the movie. But he, I think, has a kind of, quick arc where he at first is antagonist to Superman, is creating, kryptonite under Lex Luthor's command because his child's life is being threatened. But then eventually when he sees Lex Luthor kill an innocent man, he turns and decides to help Superman. And, we love to see that for him. Of course, I knew, going into this, Metamorpho was going to be a good guy. I've seen the Justice League animated shows enough to know that. I believe there's an episode of Justice League Unlimited where you have a similar kind of arc from him. And I thought that was cool to see, and I like that character. So that was a nice little plot arc within the movie as well, and I think he's a fun character, and his powers are super interesting and very well done from the graphics and everything. Then, of course, you have Clark's parents. No, I'm not talking about the Kryptonian parents, although Bradley Cooper and the other actress do a good job on that. But his real parents, the Kents, do a great job. They have some comedy as kind of like old boomer moments earlier on. And then later on, of course, we have the more heartfelt moment, especially with his dad, which I think works very well. And then, of course, at the ending, you have the montage of them taking care of him. That was like one of the more beautiful moments, a perfect ending, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. And I think they are done well. You only get little bits and pieces of them. I thought maybe they could have used a little bit more time developing the parents. I still think it works well, but that is one of the things I would go back and add a little bit more of, as well as potentially the very beginning of the movie. There's like certain things that they just say happened. And I think that some of those, at least, we could have seen glimpses of, and that would have been cooler. But, you know, I'm happy with what we got. That's just my only like little critiques here and there. Okay, so now we need to get to the bad guys. We got Lex Luthor and his goons. Nicholas Hoult does an amazing job playing him. He has that perfect supervillain energy, and I think the best scene representing that is when he's walking in to the Fortress of Solitude and everything's, you know, flying around him and he's just totally unfazed, whipping off the sunglasses. Like, perfect moment. Honestly, my favorite music, other than just like the electric Superman theme that they play the beginning and everything, is the Lex Luthor theme, or I'm not sure if that's exactly what it's called, but the kind of like villain theme that he gets, because I think he's just like such a fun comic supervillain character in this movie. He is just kind of being goofy in how villainous he is, and also scary and dark in how villainous he is in certain points in the movie, and I think it is perfect for the character. Of course, like any good supervillain, he has his goons. We have a bunch of just like unnamed or probably not named henchmen who are all, you know, relatively interesting, additions, I suppose. But most importantly, I think we have the engineer, who I think is, you know, a perfectly fine character. He has some cool like effects and everything. I thought she did a good job when they had her swearing in Spanish and stuff like that. I thought that was maybe an interesting way to get around the limits of, although there was a lot of saying shit in this movie, so I don't know how many times you're allowed to say that in the PG-13 usually. I know traditionally you only get one fuck, but it seems like there's a lot of shits, and there's some swearing in Spanish from the engineer as well. And, you know, that character was another one that wasn't super fleshed out. Apparently she has like this vendetta against Superman. We don't really know why. It is what it is. I'm not super like upset about it, but it could have maybe been more fleshed out, or we could have, I don't know. I feel like Lex's goons were a lot less interesting than him. And I include Ultraman in that, slash the Hammer of Bravia, slash, you know, Superman's clone, as it's revealed in the end of the movie. I didn't really get into him. I'm kind of like interested to see where they take the character, because he did get sucked into a black hole, but I think a lot of people are theorizing that that's going to be like some sort of Bizarro world, because Bizarro is traditionally a clone of Superman, and he'll kind of come back as Bizarro and revisit Superman as a potential future antagonist, which I think would probably work pretty well. But that seems like way more interesting than what he's doing in this movie, where he's like half the time he's just like kind of like a tough guy that as a character doesn't do anything. We never see him talk in the entire movie. We don't know anything about him other than he's a clone. He's basically just like Lex Luthor's tool, really. I mean, which, you know, is all right, but is not very interesting as a character. And I think if there were to cut any character in the movie, that's probably where I would go, even though I'm interested to see where it sets up for the future. So I can see why they put it in there. I don't think it works like amazing in this movie. It's not horrible, didn't take too much away. It just didn't really give a whole lot for me. Okay, so before we dive into the political aspects specifically of this movie, I want to just talk about the overall themes a little bit, which I think honestly were probably more on the minds of the writers and directors than the political aspects of it while this was being produced. Of course, we just generally have the message of kind of found family, that an adoption kind of, not a metaphor. I mean, Superman is adopted in the literal sense, I would say, that we see from Superman and kind of appreciating his family. I think that the twist about his Kryptonian family being kind of evil is an interesting spin on this, and you know, creates a lot of the moral dilemma that, or, you know, artificial dilemma that Superman feels, you know, as he's constantly reassured it's by his dad, by others. It's not, you know, what your Kryptonian parents said does not make you who you are. It's you and what you do that makes you who you are. That's like, you know, perhaps the most important theme of the movie. And, you know, what Superman tells Lex later in his own monologue is that, nobody's perfect and people are going to make mistakes, and that's part of being who you are. But as long as you're trying to do the best things, that's kind of what's important. I think this is all pretty good. The only thing that I didn't love about the twist with his parents is, or I guess maybe another way to put it is, another thing that could create an issue, although they could also handle it totally fine, is traditionally in the comics, Superman's symbol on his chest is, described as a symbol of hope in Krypton, but it's also described as a symbol of the House of El, his family. And that's not something you'd really want to wear with pride if your family were a bunch of weird conqueror types. So I wonder how they're going to handle that in the future, if Superman is going to change the symbol on his chest, or if they're going to retcon and say, actually this symbol means that or this. I don't know. I'm curious to see how they handle that. But that's the only thing that really came to mind as a potential issue from that. I'm overall fine with them saying that his parents are evil. I hope they don't go back and say that was actually fake this whole time, because I feel like that would just get needlessly back and forth. I think it'll be interesting to see how that's touched upon, if at all, in the Supergirl movie or future Superman movies, where he's maybe struggling with that aspect of his identity, the Kryptonian aspect, whether he should emphasize that or not, if these people were really evil like that. So I don't know, that's going to be interesting to see going forward, and I'm more interested to see kind of what future movies are going to say about that. And of course, fundamentally, Superman is a movie about being kind to everyone, including, the smallest squirrel to the biggest kaiju, and of course, all humans. Superman is very caring, and, it's not that he will never kill or harm anyone ever, but he only wants to do that when it's strictly necessary, and will do everything he can to save lives and prevent suffering. This is exemplified in a lot of different moments in the film. There's a constant kind of dynamic where someone's about to die and Superman swoops in and saves them, whether it's a squirrel or someone driving down a bridge. But I think perhaps the most interesting part of this is Superman's interaction with Molly, who is a worker at a falafel cart, and Superman is developing a relationship with him, or has developed a relationship with him prior to the film. And then Lex Luthor sees him helping Superman, and decides he's going to target him, he's going to kidnap him, and threatens Superman with killing him in order to get answers out of him. And then, of course, he does kill him in a moment that was probably one of the more shocking moments in the movie. Just a single character's death, and yet it was perhaps one of the most tense moments in the movie, even though there's moments where, the entire world is being ripped apart, because you saw the real stakes there. And Superman's going to save the day at the end of the world, but he wasn't able to save this guy. And I think that was kind of representing Superman's connection to everyday working people and how he really does care about everyone. I'd say that alone is a woke idea, that caring about everyone is good. And I wouldn't disagree with you. And if that is a woke idea, then, definitely make sure you're woke, because we wouldn't want people that are filled with hate in their hearts out there. But to dive into the more overtly political content of the movie, is it about Palestine? Is the conflict about Israel and Palestine? I think the easiest answer is just probably yes. But I think to kind of take a step back, I think it's important to give the context that all of James Gunn's, not all of, but a lot of James Gunn's superhero content, and specifically I would say the Suicide Squad and Creature Commandos, have a very generic anti-interventionist or anti-war message to them. So this isn't really surprising to see. And also those movies both involve a very corrupt and frankly kind of evil US government. So it's not really surprising to see some of those elements in this movie. That's kind of what James Gunn has already been doing in the superhero genre. And it's a balance between something that is pretty overt and not trying to really hide the fact that, war is bad and the US government intervening in other countries is going to lead to bad outcomes. It's not really trying to hide that, but it's also not trying to be very specific about which examples it's calling out, even if there are kind of obvious ones. Like in the Suicide Squad, there is a I believe Caribbean country that the US is intervening in and destroying, right? Which that's happened a lot of times in history, and there's very many accurate comparisons you could make there. But at the same time, you can tell that the filmmakers probably didn't intend for you to think of a specific country. In this movie, honestly, I would say it is the most overt comparison I have seen in James Gunn's superhero movie so far. I don't obviously know for sure what James Gunn and any other people involved in the writing of this movie were thinking, but if I had to make a Superman movie where it was about Israel and Palestine and I couldn't call the countries Israel and Palestine, this is pretty close to what you would make. You have the country of Moravia, which is pretty much only consisting of white people that we see in the movie, is a close ally of the United States, is working with American arms salesmen, specifically working with Lex Luthor, to get their weapons and it's also promising Lex Luthor, an American, part of the country that they want to invade, as a prize for that. So it's kind of like a very much a commentary on the American military-industrial complex there. And that country is a very highly technologically developed country. They say it's in Eastern Europe, so you could maybe draw a alignment between Russia and Ukraine there, but the country is aligned with the United States. The US is on their side, unlike the Russia-Ukraine war, and they're invading a poorer country that is surrounded by a fence and has no standing army, just people, all of whom look more like brown, like they could be Arab or South Asian or something. And the super powerful, militarized, mostly white country, pretty much only white country, tears down the fence and is going to invade this basically defenseless country without a really seemingly any kind of formal army or anything like that. The similarities are starting to stack up to the point where it would be hard for there not to be some sort of Israel-Palestine comparison going on in the writers' minds, frankly. Now, in terms of the sources we can look at outside of the movie to either confirm or deny this, there was actually a controversy earlier on in production about the movie potentially, or James Gunn specifically, actually having like an anti-Palestinian bias, because there was someone who was potentially, Bassem Youssef, who was going to potentially get a part in the movie, and then he didn't get a part in the movie, and he said it might have been because of comments he made about Palestine. James Gunn denied this, and based on the timing of things and the character he was going to play, which seems like it would have been some leader of potentially Jahanapur, the country Arabia is invading, I think it's a good chance that this probably was just a coincidence. But of course, in hindsight, with the movie appearing relatively pro-Palestine, it seems like it probably wasn't what was going on, but it's hard to say for sure. And then, of course, you also have what James Gunn himself said. So in an interview from the Times where he was asked what countries people might think this is referring to, he said, "Oh, I really don't know," which I can't read the tone of his voice, but I kind of feel like he might be being sarcastic there to the interviewer. Now, it's hard to read that over text. But he then goes on to continue and say, "But when I wrote this, the Middle Eastern conflict wasn't happening. So I tried to do little things to move it away from that, but it doesn't have anything to do with the Middle East. It's an invasion by a much more powerful country run by a despot into a country that's problematic in terms of its political history, but totally has no defense against the other country. It really is fictional." So with this quote, it's kind of confusing what James Gunn is doing here. You can see a kind of attempt to distance himself from Israel-Palestine and say, oh, it's not really about that. It was written before, the war that started in 2023, which of course, this conflict and, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine has gone on for much longer than just the last couple of years. So it's possible it could have inspired it. And it's, pretty likely it would have inspired it anyway, considering there was another major escalation as recently as 2021. But also there's things in the way James Gunn described it that are very similar to Israel and Palestine. Much more powerful country, and another that basically has no defense. I mean, it's pretty easy to draw the comparison there. And I'm not surprised that James Gunn is denying any explicit comparison. I mean, he is the CEO of a major company who is owned by Warner Bros. And I don't really expect major corporations to be hoping that their films are seen as this big pro-Palestine message. That just is not what you'd expect to see. And I'm not surprised that James Gunn is denying it. I mean, it might be disappointing if people have higher hopes for him having a more explicit political message, but it is definitely not surprising. And that's what you'd expect, even if this was written with the intention of representing Palestine. So another fun thing that someone has pointed out is that there is some evidence, I guess, on social media that James Gunn has been pro-Palestine. He very least liked one Instagram post that I could see people posting about. It was about Sheikh Jarrah and about Palestinians facing the threat of dispossession. That was posted by Viola Davis. So, it's very possible that he does have these beliefs and he's just been keeping it kind of low-key and they influence the writing and he doesn't want to make a big deal out of it. Or maybe he's being told he can't make a big deal out of it by people at Warner Brothers. Who knows what's going on, but I think it's a very valid reading of the movie. And like I said, if you were going to pick any countries that these two fictional countries in the movie are going to be about, making it about Israel, making it about Palestine, that makes the most sense. And I think to kind of bring in the superhero stuff to this political analysis, I think it's a really interesting way to look at what this would look like in a world of superheroes. Like Superman really should be stopping these kind of things. And I think that it's interesting to look at the way that is examined, most specifically in a conversation between Superman and Lois. It's in the trailer for the movies, and I think it's one of the most interesting scenes where you have a back and forth where Superman is defending himself saying, hey, I had to do this. People were going to die. And all the stuff that you're saying, Lois, is kind of just like ignoring that main fact and kind of trying to just go through all these other justifications. And Superman gets really frustrated and frankly acts kind of unprofessional for what would be a recorded interview. But he's also fundamentally correct about the facts of the matter, in my opinion. Whereas Lois, while I understand they're trying to, she's being portrayed as this like, inquisitive journalist, she is just kind of parroting the questions that the US government would want her to ask, which is perhaps an accurate portrayal of journalism in the modern world, but, is a little bit disappointed for someone who is supposed to be asking hard-hitting questions, In Superman and Lois, a TV show that I think is great, I haven't watched all of it yet, Lois in that show, I think, is perfect at being this amazing journalist, but also one that's always seeking to speak truth to power and not one who's ever seeking to really kind of accept the mainstream narratives. Whereas for Superman, she's like, why didn't you consult the US government? Why didn't you consider the geopolitical ramifications of stopping a war? And it's like, Superman's kind of right. Like, stopping a war is just inherently kind of a good thing to do for the, and it seems like it was, in this movie, he is proven to be correct that this is a good thing to do. I mean, the people who are invading are allying with Lex Luthor and are, part of this evil scheme. So of course you should stop them. And I think that it's interesting that they have that dynamic. I think it makes for a more entertaining movie to have that dynamic. I don't, even Lois Lane having kind of incorrect perception or at least questioning the situation is, good for her character, and I think makes sense, even if, it's not making her the most based or whatever at the beginning of the movie. I do want to emphasize that, I don't think this movie was made primarily to send some sort of political message, but I think that if you are going to tell a Superman story and do it justice, you're going to have some politics in it. Superman is someone who is struggling to find his place in society, like many immigrants. He is someone who eventually, finds his home, finds his family, recognizes his family, and the Kents and, the people that he knows around him, as he does in this movie. And I think that's a very powerful message. We also have the kind of evil capitalists, Lex Luthor being the most obvious example in this movie. There are some other capitalist industries we see in the film, which don't get explored as much. I mean, Lord Tech and Maxwell Lord are alluded to. The corporate superhero team, the Justice Gang, is sponsored by him. Maybe at first they're not quite on Superman's wavelength about saving people in the same way, but by the end of the movie they very much are, and you can tell that they're good guys fundamentally, pretty much. And Maxwell Lord himself is only present very quickly in a short scene played by Sean Gunn where he says, conservatives and liberals can agree that Lex Luthor sucks, which I think is kind of funny and maybe positioning him as like a more like liberal or woke kind of billionaire type who, maybe not woke because, he's kind of positioning himself as maybe like a more centrist-y type or whatever, but he's not like a Lex Luthor style supervillain. We'll see, I think, in the Peacemaker show and other future DCU products exactly what Maxwell Lord looks like. And of course, we also have Luthor interacting with the US government, interacting with Baravia, being this kind of like behind the scenes operative and trying to play governments to his favor, give money, give influence, sign a defense contract, all these things, which I think are very interesting portrayal of billionaires. If I had to compare him with any billionaire or modern wealthy person, it would probably be Peter Thiel, because he is a weapons contractor and he also, well, he's kind of creepy, and then also he is like kind of this like techno-futurist type, and apparently he wants to build this like utopian society in his colonized part of the world when the war is over, which, doesn't end up happening, of course, thankfully, but he kind of gives me like the creepy Silicon Valley like type, and also like an interesting part of the movie is that on all the Lex Luthor like bases and like some of his staff are like wearing like Hawaiian shirts and like having this like happy upbeat music. It's kind of giving me like just like a California Silicon Valley vibe where like it seems like this cool like happy place, but what they're doing is like deeply evil, which is, I think, a very interesting commentary on that whole situation as well. Sorry if you hear some background noise. My kitten is actually going ham on her scratching post over here, and that's what you're hearing if you notice anything in the background. Okay, so the last political theme I want to touch on is to do with journalism in the media, and specifically social media, because Lex Luthor has an army of monkeys who are basically representing troll bots, which I think is hilarious. That's one point where you could see that maybe, some liberal writing about Russia could be more of what the story is about, because, Russia is known for having like these bot troll farms or whatever, especially like a popular part of the liberal consciousness, I think, in the United States. So maybe, the Bravia allegory to Russia is a little bit there with an ally of Bravia doing this. But, honestly, all kinds of governments across the world do this kind of internet manipulation stuff. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's inspired by one government or the other. It is an interesting thing to draw attention to, like the manipulation of social media. I think it very much, people have, I think, also compared Lex Luthor to Elon Musk. I don't think it's, maybe as much of a comparison there necessarily, but, there's definitely parallels there. And obviously Elon Musk purchased a social media site, which is a little different than hiring monkeys to manipulate it. But hey, to each their own. And I think that's an interesting dynamic of, like, you have the public kind of going against or in favor of Superman based on whether Lex manipulation of the public is working or other things. And you have Lex being interviewed by like a Tucker Carlson type character, which I think is just a very fascinating conversation and commentary on the media and how it can sway public opinions and how it's not always accurate. And people who, with the best of intentions, who are fighting the good fight like Superman, may be maligned by the media unfairly. Which I'm sure James Gunn understands because he was kind of quote unquote canceled in the past and then was eventually reinstated. And, there's a whole story I'm not going to get into here, but I think it might also, relate to his own personal experiences as well. All right. So overall, I think this movie is great. It's a fun time. It's fun discourse and political analysis. I think, if I had to say whether or not this movie is woke, it's definitely woke. And I think, that is great to see in today's day and age when we have so much right-wing reaction in our politics. Superman, the character, is supposed to be a beacon of hope. And I think this film is a very hopeful and optimistic film for people of all types, people who like to see, their understanding of the world represented. And fundamentally, I think the politics of this movie are less so an overt attempt to persuade Americans of a certain belief and more just representation that there are other people out there, some of whom are making art and making media like Superman, who understand the world for what it is, who understand that the US is allied with evil governments that want to invade other countries, and represent that in this movie because that's what the world is really like. And they want to have some sort of element that reflects reality. At least that's how I look at it. And with this, I am very much looking forward to the next season of Peacemaker, which I think is also a very interesting show in terms of its politics. Maybe I'll make a video on that one day. But it's basically just making fun of conservatives and like every other joke. And I think the Peacemaker cameo in the Superman movie was doing that. We're going to see Guy Gardner and back in that movie again, potentially some other cameos. Lanterns I'm very excited for. I already said I love Green Lantern characters already. And we're going to see more of them. I mean, they're going to be the main characters there, Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart, but also Guy Gardner will probably play some smaller role as well. And then we also have Supergirl, who her cameo in this movie was also a good time, and that will be an interesting movie. I haven't read the comic that's based on yet, but I've heard people say it's very good, and I hope to read it before that movie comes out to get an idea of where that's going. So all in all, this movie is a great step forward for the DC universe. It was a good time, and yes, it is woke.